her for having accepted our invitation. Beiker is Professor of Translation Studies at the Center for Translation and Intercultural Studies, University of Manchester. She studied at the American University in Cairo, where she got a BA in English and Comparative Literature. Afterwards, she studied Applied Linguistics at the University of Birmingham, obtaining an MA. In 1995, she moved to Manchester, where she became a professor in 1997. Today, she holds that chair at the Translation Studies Center. She is, in fact, the founder of Saint Jerome Publishing, where she is currently editorial director. She also founded the international magazine, The Translator. She is the founder as well, or vice president, of the International Association of Translation and Intercultural Studies. As a researcher, she is interested in translation and conflict, the role of ethics in research and training in translation studies, in addition to the application of narrative theory to translation and interpretation. She has published extensively in these areas. She has also been active as an editor of reference works in translation. Not only is she one of the most prominent scholars of translation around the world, but she is also a brave heart, a brave Egyptian queen, and a great fighter for justice and humanity. She has led a campaign on her website on the boycott of Israeli academic institutions and Israeli products and services. A rare spirit indeed in a country where any critique of Israeli atrocities against the Palestinians is pinned down with meaningless accusations. She is a rare example to follow on the academic, cultural, political, and human level. I and many of my colleagues have a great appreciation and admiration of her. We are privileged to have Yumna with us, and we thank you again sincerely for having accepted our invitation. And I leave the floor to you now. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. I don't know, is this working?
Yes.
It is, yeah? It's maybe all right. So there's the sound of the air conditioning, I think, as well. Okay? So you can hear me, yeah? Thank you very, very much, Rima. The privilege is all mine. It's really a privilege to be here. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be in Syria. And I'm in Gilad and Nasser, so we were brought up to think of Syria as part of our home, and I already feel very much at home here, and absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to visit Damascus and to talk to colleagues here. Before I talk about I just want to mention something that I hope many of you would be interested in. Rima will know that we were both involved in a project that is sponsored by the British Academy in Britain, which involves running a series of workshops in the Arab world, Turkey and Iran in order to build capacity in the region in the area of translation and intercultural studies. So the idea of this project is that we have people coming from different parts of the Arab world and from Iran and Turkey once a year in order to learn more about how we build capacity in the region, particularly research and training capacity in order to offer better training, better both professional and research training to translators and interpreters in the region. And one of the offshoots of this project is a website which has now been finalized and is available. You can visit it and you can contribute to it if you want. And if you you want to make a note of the site address, it's, I don't know if you can see it from here, it's www.translationstudiesportal.org, and as you can see, it's called Translation Studies Portal, focus on the Arab world, Iran and Turkey. So this is a specific, it's not just about translation studies, it's very specifically geared to the needs of people in the region, in the Arab world, in Iran and in Turkey. And so if you go, for example, just to give you a very quick example, you go to the news section, not sure, yeah, you will see that most of the news has to do with events that are taking place in the region. For instance, there's one event coming up. Is this one? Is the sound all right? Is this or is this better? It is better. Okay. So in that case, we can put this aside. So you see that the events are taking place in the region. There's one in Qatar, for instance, about literary translation, the traveling text. There's one in Ain Shams University in Cairo. Again, if you go to publications, you'll see that the entries all have to do with articles and books on translation and interpreting, but with a focus either on Arabic or in Persian or in Turkish. So this is a resource really for people in the area. The media library has material that is media, for instance, video clips. So, for example, if you go here, it's the first one, you can look at video clips of Mubarak's, one of Mubarak's entertaining speeches in the last few days. I don't know why this is not showing, but actually when you go to the site, this is something to do with the Adobe Flash Player that's available on this machine. But if you go to the site, what you will see is a clip of his speech in Arabic and a clip of one of the translations into English that was televised on British television. So you have data that you can work with if you want to analyze a piece of data, for instance, in your research. But there are also there's also material. Somehow we've lost. Anyway, how'd you go back? This one? I'll go in there. Okay. And the links, again, you'll have links to a lot of things that are relevant to people working in the area, and particularly things to do that are relevant to people working with Arabic, with Persian, or with Turkish. So I hope you will make use of this site because it's a resource. You can, even if you want to register, and depending on how reliable you are, if you want access to help build the resource itself, help to post material on the site, you can register and your registration will be authorized and you'll be able to input material. So this is a resource for all of us in the region, and I hope that people will make use of it and will also help to build it over time. Okay. Bear with me for a minute while I discover this. It doesn't seem to go back. Okay, I just want to make sure that I know how to move it back and forward. Okay, before I tell you what I'm going to talk about today, I want to just contextualize it a bit. And do feel free, I know this is a big auditorium and it's a little bit intimidating, particularly for students, but I hope you won't be too intimidated, and if there's anything that I'm saying you don't understand or you want clarified or you want to argue with it, please do stop me, just raise your hand and I will try and explain it. But before I tell you what I'm going to tell you today, I just want to contextualize it by saying that I, for one, and I think there's an increasing number of people who are beginning to think in similar ways, do not believe that it is a responsible thing for people who want to become translators and interpreters to simply practice translation and interpreting without reflecting on what they're doing and what others are doing in that area. I think that it's a translator or an interpreter who is not able to reflect on the impact of what they're doing and the impact of the different choices that they make is a danger to themselves and to society. And therefore, I would, despite the fact that most people in the field, at least most students, approach the field wanting to just be trained to acquire a skill. They want to have a lot of practice and simply be able to produce a text in another language or an interpretation in another language, full stop, and they think that's what makes them translators and interpreters. I would argue that although this is very important, and it's very important to get the mechanics of the language right, it's not enough. You also have to be able to think critically because you, apart from being a translator or interpreter, you are also a social and political actor. You are part of a society, and the actions that you take, including the way you interpret, the way you translate, has an impact on other people who live in your vicinity and for whom you mediate. And therefore, it is very important to be able to reflect critically, not just on your own output, but also on everything else that's going on around you when you translate and interpret. Because you never translate or interpret in a vacuum. You're always surrounded by other people who are doing other things around you, and what they're doing has an impact on how the text you're producing is received, for example. So it's not just about what you do, but it's also about what other people do in the larger context in which you are producing your translation or your interpretation. Just to kind of put things again in context, it's not that I downgrade the importance of language or the importance of getting the mechanics of language right, but this is another area that I've written about and talked about extensively before. Some of you will be familiar with my course book, In Other Words, and the second edition has just come out, which I will leave here for Rima. And a book like this is all about the language, language structures, how language works, what you can do with language in order to make sure that you get things right linguistically. But today, as if you are sitting somewhere on your own and producing a text, and your only problem is the language and how to control the language to get the effects that you want. Today, I want to take a step back and look at the larger picture and say, once you've got to grips with the language, you know what you're doing with the language, and you've got those skills, you then have to think in a broader context and see how your text fits into the larger social and political reality of which you are a part and to which you contribute as a translator or an interpreter. And for this, I want to work with a particular theoretical concept. Don't be frightened of theory. Theory is, as it's explained properly, it's both easy and empowering because it allows you to reflect on what you're doing. So I want to work with a particular theoretical concept that I elaborated in a number of publications that you have on your handout, if you have a copy of the handout. And this is the concept of narrative. And yeah, this works. Very briefly, what I mean by narrative, because I want to use this concept as the unit of analysis. We often talk in translation and interpreting about things like, do we translate words? Do we translate clauses? Do we translate sentences? Do we translate paragraphs? Do we translate entire text? Is the text as a whole the unit of translation? I'm going to argue and try and convince you with examples that a more productive way of looking at what we translate and the unit with which we grapple when we translate is to think of the unit of translation as a narrative, an entire story that we are contributing to the elaboration of. And very briefly, what I mean by narrative is precisely that, story. A story, any story, unfolds in time, so it's changing, it's dynamic. It has a perceived beginning, and where you put the beginning of the story is itself very important. And it has a projected end, something that you expect to happen if the story develops in a particular particular way. Very importantly, and this is one of the things we really need to take on board in translation and interpreting, very importantly, that story is not just something that we as translators and interpreters produce. We don't have full control of it. It's constructed by lots of different agents. And it's very important in our field to begin to pay attention to the other agents who are involved in the translation context, who have a bearing on the way the story we are contributing to elaborating is both received and constructed. So, for example, when you produce a piece of literature in translation, a translated poem, a translated novel, or when you produce a bit of media translation, for instance, a voiceover in a documentary and so on, the way people receive and understand what's going on is not just dependent on the bit that you've contributed, the translation you've contributed. It's also dependent on what other agents do, what the publishers do with the translation, what the editors do after you finish your translation or while you're doing your translation, what the person who's putting the documentary together does. Very simply, for example, the title that they give the documentary can give viewers a particular take on the translation that you provide that you may not have even anticipated. So a story is constructed by many different agents and not just by the translator, and the translator and the interpreter have to be aware of those agents and what they're doing in order to understand how the texts that they are producing are going to be used and what kind of narratives they participate in elaborating. The story, any story or narrative, is populated by a lot of participants, real or animate or inanimate, if you like. And so if you agree with me that everything around us is really made up of stories, our understanding of the world, our appreciation, the decisions that we make are based on a series of stories, narratives that we entertain about the world. If you accept this, then you have to think of everything ultimately as a form of story, a constructed story. So, for example, most of you probably will be aware that there are all kinds of, we normally call them arguments, floating around in society today about climate change. Some scientists tell us that the climate is changing because of the way we use deodorants and other things that we use. We are damaging the climate. We are bringing the ice age forward. There's something called the ozone layer, which is in danger of being eroded, and so on and so forth. Now, within this particular theoretical model, I would say that this is one type of narrative that is elaborated in society. And this narrative, this story or set of stories, because there are conflicting stories, there are also scientists who insist that none of this is happening, all this is exaggerated, we don't have to worry, and so on. But this story or set of stories have participants, such as the scientists who elaborate the stories, but also things like the ozone layer. The ozone layer is a very important participant in this story. It's an inanimate participant, but it's a very important participant. This is the thing that all kinds of things are happening to, and that threatens our way of life and so on. So stories, if you think of everything as a narrative in that sense, are populated by a variety of participants who are in a particular relationship to each other and to the unfolding story. Those of you who have a literary training, and I understand many do, will not be unfamiliar with this way of thinking about things. Okay? And very importantly, stories and narratives are realized in a variety of media, so that verbal language is not the only medium of elaborating stories. Images, photographs, for example, are extremely important and increasingly important today because we have become a very visual culture. And we are, if you've been following events in Egypt, for example, in the past few weeks, you will know, as I know, that one of the things that has really influenced the way we think about what is happening are the pictures we saw on television. So, and all these pictures contribute to a story or set of stories about what's been happening both individual stories and the larger story of what's happening in the region that influence our behavior and our understanding and appreciation of the people involved in the story. So the fact that stories are realized in various media is very important, both because it reflects what is really happening, the way we make decisions about who's right, who's wrong, why something is happening and so on, but also is very important because if you're a translator or an interpreter today, you know that in many contexts, what the texture that you produce is going to be part of a larger text that includes a lot of visuals. A lot of translators, for example, today work with web material. It's one of the most profitable types of translation that you can engage in is to get involved in localizing websites, producing websites in different languages. This is very big business now. Now, websites actually tend to have relatively little verbal material and a lot of interaction between verbal and visual material. So you have to take that kind of thing on board. And you have to understand that ultimately when you are localizing the website, you are contributing to the elaboration of a story of a company, for example, or a particular group through a combination of both visual and verbal material. Now I want to give you an example of how this works in practice in terms of translation, and the example here is not about how you translate. If you want to learn about how you translate particular stretches of text, you can look at books like In Other Words. The example is about how you reflect on how the translation you produce may be incorporated into a larger narrative that if you have not been trained to reflect critically on what you do, you may not be aware of. So this is a website called Watching America. Very important for people in our region. It's not the only website that does this. Lots of websites today that are set up in places like the United States to intervene in current discourses and conflicts that are going on in the area rely very, very heavily on translations in order to narrate the region in ways that serve their particular agendas. This website is called Watching America. Would you like to translate for Watching America? If you go to the website, they actually encourage you to volunteer as a translator to contribute to what they do. If you look, I don't know if this is working. Doesn't seem to be working. Okay, that's fine. If you look to the left-hand side at the top, you will see the logo of the website, Watching America with a magnifying glass on a map of America. Can you see it all right from the back? Yeah? So this is part of, oh, thank you. Still doesn't work. Something to do with the area here, I think, rather than still doesn't work. Doesn't matter. Cursor from a laptop. It doesn't matter. Essentially, so the part of the narrative of this group that set up this website called Watching America is obviously elaborated visually, so that you see a map of America, you see a magnifying glass fixed on America. It's the same as saying Watching America, so that the message is elaborated both visually and verbally. And the website is supposed to be, if you read the About Us page, is supposed to be about translating material from many different parts of the world into English in order to inform largely the American public about how other people think about America. Okay? But in the course of doing so, of course, they are also elaborating narratives about those other parts of the world. They elaborate those narratives through the selection of what they actually translate and what they don't translate, for example. But they also elaborate it in other very interesting ways. And so if you go to further down the page, because I can't do that here, if you go further down the page, you will see that those who set up the site split it into three sections. There are three categories. Categorization, classification is one of the major ways in which people elaborate narratives, because narratives have to have participants, and these participants have to belong to particular categories. And so, very interestingly, this particular narrative elaborated by this particular website divides the world essentially into two blocks. One called the East and one is called the West. The third block is, according to them, is global content in English. It's not translations, it's material that is originally published in English in different parts of the world, because most parts of the world have their own English gazettes and they publish material in English as well as their own languages. It's the first two sections that concern us here, and these are split into translations from the West and translations from the East. And if you look at what comes under each bit, it's very interesting because, for instance, under translations from the West, each of these lines is, if you like, a hyperlink. If you click on it, it takes you to an English translation of a particular article from the language that is indicated. And they also usually have also a link to the original article, for instance, in French, in Arabic, in Persian, or whatever. So what you have in that section is an article from French, from France, two articles from France. Further down is an article from Germany, another one from France, another one from France, but also you have an article from Mexico. Okay, so Mexico, which is in Spanish America, in Latin America, is part of the West. According to this narrative, it is part of the West. If you look at the East, you have China, you have Singapore, you have Turkey, you have, if you look at other pages on other days, you will have lots of articles from Arabic, different parts of the Arab world. You'll have articles from Iran. So the narrators of this site are telling you that the world is split into two camps. This is a familiar story, of course. Anybody who watches the news, who follows the news, understands where this is going. It's going to the direction of kind of clash of civilizations and so on. And basically the idea is the world is split up into two camps. One is called the West, primarily identified by belonging to Christianity, essentially by the Christian faith. And another one called the East, which is primarily identified by the fact that they share either the Islamic religion or some other religion that is not Christianity, like as in China. Okay? So if you are a translator or an interpreter and you contribute a site like this, it's not enough to think, have I produced a good translation? Have I produced an accurate translation? Have I been ethical in the way I have reflected what is in the source text? Because irrespective of what you've done, other actors come along, as they do here, and they put a particular spin on the translation that you've produced. They incorporate it or appropriate it into a larger narrative that if you are not aware of, you run the risk of your work and your own ethics, your own efforts being appropriated in a larger program that you may or may not approve of. You may or may not see the world in these terms. You may or may not agree that the world is split up into East and West and Christianity versus the rest of the world. Okay. So, so the importance of this, why is narrative important? Why is it important to think of the way people narrate the world and how we as translators and interpreters fit into this picture? It's important because the idea is that narrative decides or shapes the way you behave. It's not just about listening to stories. They're not bedtime stories that you just listen to and go to sleep and nothing happens. These are stories that shape your behavior and shape other people's behavior, and in extreme cases end up with very violent major wars and conflicts. So because people act according to the stories that they believe about the world around them, it is very important for all social actors, not just translators and interpreters, to be aware of the kind of stories that they contribute to and that they are actively elaborating, whether knowingly or unknowingly, when they produce any kind of communication. Just very quickly going through, and I'll give you some more concrete examples, going through some of the basic assumptions here that I'm talking about. Basically, I'm suggesting that these stories mediate our understanding of reality, that we have no direct access to reality. Different people entertain different stories about what is going on at any point in time. So our take on reality is always mediated by stories, and these stories construct reality for us, because if you believe in a certain set of stories, after a while you begin to act according to these beliefs, and your actions actually act on the environment, and therefore they reproduce the stories that may even start out as stories, pure stories, but ultimately they construct reality. The most important thing to my mind about translation and interpreting is precisely the fact that they contribute to the elaboration of narratives that shape reality. So the most important thing about what we do is not that we can earn a lot of money or relatively little money by doing it. It's not because we provide understanding and a bridge between cultures, as we're often told, a kind of metaphor that really masks the potential damage that we can do by engaging in particular types of translation. The most important thing about what we do is that, like social actors, what we do participates in construction of reality, and the construction of global reality, because globally, people outside don't just think of what people around you in Syria think, because a lot of what happens to you here is also shaped by and decided by people who are living in other environments who hear stories about you through translation. So it's very important to take an interest in these things. And what I'm also suggesting is that the basic unit of analysis, ultimately, if you're thinking particularly from an ethical perspective, the basic unit of analysis is the narrative, not the clause, the word, the sentence, the text, and so on. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute, several examples.